Hello, welcome to History of Russia, the Soviet Union, and beyond. Today we're going to learn about the ancient Rus, and we'll start with the early occupants of the Western Eurasian plain, and we'll discuss the Huns, the Avars, the Khazars, and then we will close out with our conclusions. So the ancient Rus. So what do we mean when we say ancient Rus? Rus is a term that we're going to use to refer to the territory that will later become Russia. It's a term that will apply until around the 1300s, and all we know about ancient Rus is that it's really shrouded in mystery. There's just not a lot of historical sources to learn about it, and we're forced to learn about ancient Rus through the archaeological records. There's just not a lot of writings that existed in ancient Rus. For example, people have occupied the Russo area for thousands of years before Christianity, and we just know that because of the history of Christianity and then the archaeological findings that we find in that area as well. We also know that this area has served as an amalgamation of numerous cultures from Western Asia, the Black Sea, and the Caucasus Mountains. Things that we don't know, however, are whether or not this area was the aboriginal homeland of the Slavic and Proto-Slavic peoples. Little is known about the origins of the Slavs. I mean, you could read plenty of theories and hypotheses of where the Slavs came from and when they came from there and whatnot. But the fact is that all of those are just theories. There's no archaeology or history to actually back them up. So you could read about them and make your own decisions about those things, but just know that no one could say for a fact what the history of the Slavs were. But we do know that they didn't settle into the Eurasian plain until several centuries after the beginning of the Christian era. All right, let's move on to the early occupants of the Western Plain. So the Western Eurasian Plain, the cradle of Russian history, was inhabited by primitive peoples for hundreds of thousands of years before the arrival of the Slavs. The archaeological record has found evidence of human habitation in the Paleolithic Age, or the Old Stone Age, dating back to 1 million years ago up until 8,000 BC, or I guess 10,000 years ago. There is even better evidence of peoples in the region from the Stone Age or 4,000 years ago. So more evidence exists for the people that existed there 4,000 years ago. And finally, as early as, again, 1,000 years before the Christian era, there has been a wave after wave of new peoples moving westward from Asia and the Middle East. And as we'll see, each one is going to leave their unique cultural footprint behind. But this area, historically speaking, is a prime area for Asian invaders to come through. And the first ones we're going to talk about today are the Cimmerians. So they are the first recorded history of people entering the region. And it's believed that they came from Thracian stock, like the Thracian culture. They appeared there around 1000 BC, and they arrived as conquerors who imposed their rule on those fragmented societies that existed before them. Some experts believe that since the Cimmerians were skilled in iron, they could have been the first culture to take the Russo inhabitants out of the Stone Age and straight into the Iron Age, completely skipping the Bronze Age. That's all we really know about the Cimmerians. But after the Cimmerian rule, we're going to bring in the Scythians. And to back up for a moment, you gotta realize the Eurasian steppe and what it is. So for most of prehistoric human history, the steppe was a very harsh environment for the ancient peoples. Remember what it looked like in the last episode? It was just long stretches of nothingness, sea, like just wheats and grass growing, and it wasn't a great vegetative place or anything like that. Just long stretches of grass that went on forever. And something amazing happened with humans was the domestication of horses and other flocking livestock. And what that did is it provided a new opportunity for a better way of life. So prior to the domestication of horses and other flocking livestock, there wasn't an opportunity for making the steppe a stomping ground for any civilization. But once those did happen, the steppe was a very viable place to live. In fact, it will become a very opportunistic and advantageous one because of the domestication of horses and other flocking livestock. And so this is where your great nomadic pastoralists are going to come in. The Scythians are going to be the first ones, or the first big awesome ones, but you're going to see the Huns and the Mongols and others throughout the histories taking advantage of this domestication. And so, as I said, they're one of the earliest cultures that took advantage of this domestication. From around the 7th century BC, the Cimmerians were replaced as that dominant ruling element by the Scythians. And this led many experts to say that it was actually the Scythians who introduced iron to the ancient Rus. And by this point, the Scythians absolutely did. They were iron in the Iron Age, using iron artifacts. Like that is a complete known. Like whether historians say it was the Cimmerians or the Scythians that brought it, it's inconclusive whether the Cimmerians brought it, but by the time the Scythians were there, it was absolutely certain that the Scythians brought iron technologies with them, and we know this through their weapons, their tools, and even their jewelry. The Scythians were pretty much badass nomads. They were the first people to master archery from horseback. If you look at old Cimmerian arts, you'll see soldiers on like cavalry on horseback with swords and whatnot, but the Scythians were shooting bows from their horseback, which is going to play into how battles are going to take place from now on. It's also important to note that the Scythians weren't only one ethnic group, but they were many who were united under the similar culture of being a pastoral nomad. So if you study Scythian history in general, you'll see that the Scythians kind of were taking over a large swath of Asia and Europe, and each one kind of has its own little tribes, but they all were collectively united through this pastoral nomadic culture that they had. And the Greek accounts in the west of the western borders of the Scythian nation and the Chinese reports on the eastern borders of that Scythian nation, they describe the Scythians as pale, blue-eyed, red-haired people. Some of the unique cultures that the Scythians would have brought would have been their jewelry that I mentioned. The ornaments were in this style called animal style, because they had a lot of animal shapes and some fake animals, real animals, but it's pretty obvious to see how animals were a huge part of the Scythian culture. They portrayed them in a lot of their art and jewelry. And the clothing that they wore was described as very ornate and colorful with different fabrics. The art was described as sophisticated and fashionable. And what's interesting about Scythian society is that it brought women to the table as leaders. Women had more rights compared to the settled down societies like the farmer and agricultural societies, where women had less rights because of their inability to produce valuable labor. To the contrary, nomadic societies are going to give women a lot more rights. And we'll if you study other nomadic societies, you would see that pattern go on as well. But this is also going to affect, when we say that each culture leaves its mark, like this is also going to leave a mark too. Like the fact that women are now having more rights compared to some of their agricultural predecessors. The Greeks described the Scythian women as offspring from Hercules and snake women and Amazons. It was very obvious that the women were seen as a very strong stock. They were not only warriors in the society, but there's evidence that they were also rulers in some cases as well. So let's move on to the Greeks. So at the same time that the Scythians came into ancient Rus, the Greeks were also popping up, but they were popping up in a different area near Crimea. From there, they spread out along the northern border of the Black Sea. They created trading posts and they founded cities in the region. And the Greeks were going to open up the entire world to ancient Rus. They're going to open up trade to the Scythians. And this is huge. Like back when the Greeks were running the show, you wanted to be friends with the Greeks because you're going to open up your culture to awesomeness. The Scythians are now going to have access to all that Greek culture, the Greek philosophy, the Greek math, the Greek architecture. An entirely new world is going to present itself into the Western Eurasian plain via this connection to the Greeks. And this is also good for Scythian history too, because it's going to help their history get recorded. Remember, not all these ancient cultures recorded their own history, and the Greeks were literate people, and they wrote down histories. Herodotus is going to create one of the most famous writings called History, and most of the history that we know about the Scythians is from the Greeks. Herodotus, he applied the word Scythian to cover a geographic region and the ethnic sense to all diverse peoples living in the Eurasian plain. So keep that in mind too. All right, we'll move on to the Sarmatians. So as we move through time into the 3rd century BC, a new group of warrior tribes comes into town. And here comes the Sarmatians. They flow into the Western Eurasian plain in Central Asia. It's believed that they were ethnic Iranians and that they replaced the Scythians as the rulers in town by the mid-2nd century BC. They were nomadic cattle breeders who lived in transportable felt huts, and they would relocate their societies with their herds. Like, supposedly, these huts had wheels on them, and when the herds moved, they moved the huts with the herds. So they didn't have to rebuild their huts every single time they moved. The Sarmatians are going to have mixed Scythian culture and continued trading relationships with the Greeks. They're going to have the remaining Scythian culture mix into their own. All right. And then shortly after the Sarmatians, another group of invaders started entering the Western Eurasian plain, and they're going to be called the Goths. So the Goths were Scandinavian peoples who began moving southward. So this is these are new people coming in from a different direction now. The Goths were a conquering society that took over many villages and displaced many of its members. Their society was a coalition type society, so they didn't unify the conquered lands well when they took over the West Eurasian villages. And the Goths themselves are going to later divide into two separate confederations by the mid-4th century AD. The Ostrogoths and the Visigoths, which mean East Goths and West Goths. And the Goths themselves didn't achieve a very high level of culture. And this is evidenced through the archaeology that the conquerors mostly adapted in the existing cultures of the lands that they conquered. So they weren't very influential. They just conquered and then took over what was the culture that was already in place for the most part. The Huns. So during the 4th century AD, a new and terrifying force swept out of Central Asia into Western Eurasian plain and beyond, and they were the Huns. The Chinese successfully repelled their nomadic expansion via the Great Wall, Kievan, Mulan, but since they couldn't go eastward, they were forced to go westward when they decided that they needed to expand. And the Huns clashed against the Alans, which was a remnant tribe of the Sarmatians that we just talked about. And those Alans were occupying the Don River and the Sea of Azov areas. So now the Huns are pushing them further west. And so the Alans were now going into the Goth lands, because remember, the Goths came from the west. And the Huns kept going westward. So they were just pushing the Alans into the Goths. The Huns went so far west that they displaced the Alans, or the Sarmatians that we talked about, and the Visigoths, and the Ostrogoths, and all these societies got kicked out of the Eastern Eurasian steppe, So the Visigoths are going to go into Gaul, which is like where modern-day France is. The Ostrogoths went into Thrace, which is down to the south. They also seized Italy, and this is essentially where the Western Roman Empire gets destroyed. I mean, of course, it kind of splits up into the Eastern Empire, which is later going to turn into the Byzantine Empire. And then, the Austrians are going to try to salvage it. But this is pretty much the ending of the Western Roman Empire as we knew it. The Alans fled into the Caucasus Mountains, and those people are still there today. Those descendants are called the Ossetians, and the most famous Ossetian that you probably know today is Joseph Stalin. So Attila the Hun. So the Huns are going to reach their greatest strength under Attila the Hun. He's the most famous one of the Huns that everyone probably knows about. Under his leadership, he skirmished with the Byzantines in 447. He invades Frankish Gaul in 451, and he attacks Italy in 452. And he was just about to conquer all of Europe. But luckily for Europe, before the entire continent was conquered by him, he died in 453. And like many strong empires that united under a great leader, the Hun Empire is going to fall apart from within, which is a world history lesson that pretty much always repeats itself. So after the Huns controlled much of Europe, they were soon about to give away concede their territories and leadership to the Avars, which is going to be the next wave of invaders. The Avars were a mixture of Turkish, Mongolian, and Chinese elements. They conquered the region by the mid-6th century. They consolidated the remaining Hun elements and surviving groups into a powerful state that extended from the Volga River in the east to the Elbe River in the west. They were so powerful that they could force the Byzantine Empire to pay them tribute in 581. According to the Byzantine sources, these Avar groups had Slavs conducting their state's bidding. These records are the first proof that the Slav peoples had moved into the Western Eurasian plain. So let me repeat, this is the first time that we could actually see those Slav peoples that run all those Slavic states today in the written history. Just wanted to point that out. The Avars were, however, very oppressive to the Slavic people. By the fourth of the 7th century, the Byzantines defeated the Khazars, and the Khazars would forever be a state in decline. And over the fallout of these diverse people, the Huns, the Avars, the Antes, the Altaic Turks, the Slavs, a new military power arose in the Black and Caspian Seas, and that's going to be the Khazars. And the Khazars were Turkic nomads who grew into commercial relationships with the Byzantines and the Arabs to the east. They were likely a wealthy society who acted as middlemen between the Arabs and the Greeks. The Khazars extended their influence into the Dnieper River basin, compelling many Slavs to pay tribute. However, unlike their Avar predecessors, they were less oppressive than their Avar predecessors and had respect for the Slavic warrior spirit. This extension into Slavic territories brought prosperity to the Slavic people due to the different trade that the Khazars facilitated. And while the Khazars were in power, the three prominent religions attempted to convert the powerful Khazars into their faith. Sometime during the late 8th or early 9th century, the Khazars converted into Judaism, but they never made it an official religion for the state. The rule of the Khazars brought unity among the people of the Dnieper River region. But we ask, was the unity formed from the great prosperity that the Khazars brought? Or was it brought by the formal state structure ruled by the Khazars? And historians debate this. What brought the unity of that region, the Dnieper River region where all the Slavs are? But by the 8th century, Slavic tribes were settling into the Dnieper River region, and these settlements are going to become the nucleus for the future Kievan state that we're trying to build up towards right now. So, as you can see, many different people and cultures rolled through these lands, but the Slavs today are the owners of those lands. And interestingly, they were the latecomers to these lands. I mean, they didn't come until like centuries after the original people were there. And then, of course, before they were those so-called original people there, according to the historical record, we know for a fact that there was people before those people. The earliest definite evidence of their presence in the Eurasian plain is around the 6th century. And at this time, the Slavic or Proto-Slavic tribes moved out of Central Europe and settled into the Dnieper River Basin. These tribes would later subdivide into 3 groups: the Great Russians of Russia, the White Russians of Belarus or Belorussia, the Little Russians or Ukrainians, and then other Slavic tribes moved into different directions as well, such as the Balkans in the south. They would later become the Serbs, the Croats, the Slovenes, and the Bulgars. Others moved westward to become the Poles, the Czechs or Bohemians, the Slovaks, the Moravians, the Kashubs, and the Wends. According to the primary Russian chronicle, there's going to be 13 Eastern Slavic groups. So, conclusion. Analyzing history from this context is an incredible privilege that we all get to share. I ask you, do you think it's fair that the Slavs today are the owners of these lands? And when does someone have land rights? Should the Cimmerian, Scythian, Khazar, and Goth ancestors have better claim to these lands because they were there before the Slavs? Today, in 2022, we see a nation, Russia, imposing its claim onto Ukraine via military force. Their Slavic ancestors never occupied this territory until the 6th century AD. And before them, there were rich and sophisticated cultures of people who lived in these lands. They traded with the Byzantine Greeks, they brought prosperity, they had families, and they lived entire fulfilling lives. When did those people lose claims to their land? When do people of a nation lose claim to its land? So again, thank you for listening. Next week, we're going to cover the formation of the Kievan state and the scholarly theories around it. I pretty much brought you all the generalized summed up history that brings us up to the formation of the Kievan state. We finally have a settled Slavic peoples in the Dnieper River Basin, and we're going to see how that Kievan state starts. So if you like what you just heard, please consider liking, subscribing, share these videos with your friends. You know, this is a really important time, I think, to study this type of history. We are at the brink of a World War III, potentially. So be a good citizen of the world. Keep seeking knowledge, keep reading, and stay safe. Thank you.